The wind that whipped around the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower that October night was not a howl, it was a hum. It pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Caldwell and Moore architectural firm with a vibrating tension, a sound like a cello string pulled too tight and waiting to snap. Inside, the silence was absolute. Sylvia moved through the darkened bullpen with the practiced grace of someone who had spent a lifetime memorizing the rhythm of invisible things. She did not walk. She glided. The wheels of her gray utility cart were well-oiled, silent on the plush charcoal carpet. At 32, Sylvia had learned that invisibility was a uniform. She wore the navy blue jumpsuit of the cleaning staff not as a badge of shame, but as a cloak of safety. 3 years ago, her hands had commanded the keys of a Steinway in concert halls from Vienna to Boston. Now, those same long, dexterous fingers held a microfiber cloth and a bottle of ammonia. She preferred the ammonia. It smelled like erasure. It smelled like a blank slate. She stopped at a row of drafting tables, wiping away the rings of coffee and the smudges of graphite left behind by the junior associates. She worked with a musical cadence. Spray, wipe, pause. Spray, wipe, pause. In her mind, the office was a frozen orchestra, and she was the conductor of its restoration, resetting the stage for the next day's performance. But there was one room she always saved for last. The corner office belonged to Bennett Caldwell. It was a sanctuary of intimidation. While the rest of the firm was cluttered with models and chaos, Bennett's office was a void of terrifying perfection. The furniture was sharp-edged, mid-century modern. The desk was a slab of black marble that looked like a deep, frozen lake. Sylvia approached the heavy glass door. It was usually dark by 11 p.m. Bennett was a man of rigorous discipline, known for leaving exactly at 8 o'clock to attend charity galas or family dinners that looked good in the society pages. She pushed the door open, ready to confront the darkness. But the room was not dark. A single architectural lamp was bent low over the desk, casting a pool of clinical white light. And Bennett was there. He was standing by the window, his back to her. He had removed his suit jacket, tossing it carelessly onto a leather chair. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were tense, corded with muscle. He wasn't looking at the city skyline, a glittering grid of ambition spreading out toward the horizon. He was looking at his own reflection in the glass. Sylvia froze. The spray bottle slipped in her grip, the plastic creaking loudly in the stillness. Bennett turned. He was a man built of lines and angles, much like the buildings he designed. His face was handsome in a severe, classical way, but his eyes, dark and piercing, held a depth of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. He didn't look angry at the intrusion. He looked resigned. "I apologize, Mr. Caldwell," Sylvia whispered, her voice rusty from hours of disuse. She stepped back, pulling the cart with her. "I thought the office was clear. I can come back." "No," Bennett said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the sharp authority she heard him use on the phone during the day. It sounded cracked. "Don't go. The silence in here is loud tonight." He turned back to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold pane. "Do you ever look at the city, miss?" He paused, realizing he didn't know her name. He had walked past her 100 times, but he had never seen her. "Sylvia," she supplied softly. "Sylvia," he repeated, testing the weight of the syllables. "Do you ever look at the city and wonder how many of these buildings are actually standing and how many are just waiting to fall?" Sylvia looked at his silhouette against the city lights. She understood that question. She knew what it was like to be a structure that looked whole on the outside while the foundation was turning to dust. "Buildings don't just fall, Mr. Ashford," she said, correcting herself internally. Caldwell, not Ashford. The name of the tragedy from her past slipped in. She took a breath. "Mr. Caldwell, they only fall if the tension isn't resolved. If the weight is distributed unevenly." Bennett turned fully then. He looked at her with a sudden, sharp curiosity. He looked at the cleaning cart, then at her face, noticing for the first time the intelligence burning behind her guarded expression. "Tension," Bennett murmured. "Yes, that is the problem. We build glass walls to convince the world we are invincible, forgetting that glass doesn't just protect us, it puts our loneliness on display." He walked to his desk. He picked up a piece of heavy cream-colored stationery. He had been writing. His fountain pen lay uncapped next to it. For a second, Sylvia thought he was going to read it to her. Instead, a look of frustration crossed his face. He crumpled the paper in his fist, crushing the heavy stock into a tight, jagged ball. "Clean the room, Sylvia," Bennett said, his voice suddenly shutting down, the wall sliding back into place. "I'm leaving. Erase everything." He tossed the crumpled ball of paper into the wastebasket by the door. He grabbed his jacket and walked past her. He didn't say goodnight. He moved with the desperate urgency of a man fleeing a crime scene. Sylvia stood alone in the office. The scent of his cologne, cedar and something colder, like rain on pavement, lingered in the air. She moved to the desk to wipe it down. She polished the marble until it shone. She emptied the shredder. Finally, she reached for the wastebasket. She picked up the crumpled ball of paper. It was heavy, expensive. She knew she should throw it in the black trash bag on her cart. It was trash. It was debris. But she was a musician. She understood that the most important notes are often the ones the composer deletes. Her hand trembled. She looked at the door to ensure he wasn't coming back. Then, slowly, carefully, Sylvia smoothed out the paper on the marble desk. The ink was black, the handwriting sharp and aggressive, but the words were a bleeding wound. She began to read the letter he had tried to destroy, and as she read the first line, the world of the office vanished, replaced by the terrifying realization that the man who built skyscrapers was living in a ruin. The letter was not a correspondence, it was a confession. Sylvia stood under the solitary light of the desk lamp, her eyes tracing the jagged, angry strokes of Bennett's fountain pen. The paper felt heavy, like linen, expensive and durable, meant to last centuries. But the words scrawled upon it were fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. "I am designing a cathedral for a god I do not believe in," the letter read. "My father calls it a legacy. My partners call it a landmark. I call it a tomb. I am 36 years old, and I have never drawn a single line that belonged to me." Sylvia's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the signature, just a sharp initial, B, and then at the empty office around her. To the world, Bennett Caldwell was the architect of the future, a man of steel and vision. But on this crumpled page, he was a prisoner tapping out a code on the bars of his cell, hoping someone, anyone, would hear. She didn't throw the letter away. She folded it. She smoothed the creases with her thumb, feeling the texture of the ink, and slipped it into the deep pocket of her utility jumpsuit. It was a theft, she knew, but throwing it into the shredder felt like an act of violence she couldn't commit. Over the next month, the 42nd floor became a stage for a play performed in near silence. Bennett stopped leaving at 8 p.m. He began to stay until the cleaning crew arrived. He would sit at his desk, the city lights creating a halo of artificial gold behind him, working on blueprints that seemed to sprawl endlessly across the marble. When Sylvia entered, he didn't dismiss her. He didn't look up with annoyance. He simply lifted his hand in a small, weary wave, a permission to exist in his space. She worked around him. The rhythmic swish of her cloth against the glass cabinets became a metronome for his drafting. She moved the dust from his shelves. He moved the skylines of cities. They were two people working in the same room, separated by a tax bracket, a uniform, and 1,000 unsaid words, yet bound by a mutual appreciation for the quiet. One Tuesday, the air in the office was stifling. The heating system was overactive, combating the November chill outside, turning the glass box into a terrarium. Bennett was pacing. He had unbuttoned his collar, his tie draped over the drafting table like a dead snake. He stopped when Sylvia knelt to polish the chrome leg of his guest chair. "Do you know anything about tension, Sylvia?" he asked suddenly. He didn't look at her. He looked at a model of a suspension bridge sitting on a pedestal. Sylvia paused, her cloth hovering over the metal. She thought of the strings of a piano, wound so tight that a single hammer strike could make them sing or snap. She thought of a tension in her own chest every time she walked into this room. "Tension is necessary, Mr. Caldwell," she answered, her voice low, keeping her eyes on her work. "Without it, the bridge sags. With too much, it snaps. The art is in the balance." Bennett turned slowly. He looked at the woman in the gray jumpsuit, kneeling on his floor. He looked at her hands, long, slender fingers that moved with a dexterity that spoke of something other than manual labor. "The balance," he repeated. He walked over to her, extending a hand. Not to help her up, but to gesture for her to stop. "Stand up for a moment. Please." Sylvia stood. She wiped her hands on her apron, self-conscious of the smell of lemon polish clinging to her skin. She felt small next to him. He was tall, imposing, radiating the heat of a man who was burning up from the inside. "You have the hands of an artist," Bennett observed, his gaze fixed on her fingers. "Not a cleaner." "We do what we must to survive," Sylvia replied, pulling her hands behind her back, hiding the evidence of her former life. "Cleaning is honest work. It creates order." "Order," Bennett scoffed softly, a bitter smile touching his lips. "I spend my life creating order out of concrete, and yet my own life is a chaotic mess." He walked back to his desk and picked up a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. He didn't drink it. He just held it, staring into the refraction of the light. "My family has arranged a merger," he said, the words slipping out as if he couldn't hold them back any longer. "Not of companies, of bloodlines. I am to announce my engagement to the daughter of the Moore estate next week. It will secure the firm's future for the next century. We sacrifice our own happiness on the altar of expectation, believing that if we bleed enough, the stone gods of duty will finally smile upon us." Sylvia felt a cold stone drop in her stomach. A merger? A marriage? Of course. He was a prince of industry. Princes didn't marry the women who emptied their trash cans. They married the names that looked good on invitations. "Congratulations, sir," she whispered. The word tasted like ash. "Don't lie to me, Sylvia," Bennett said sharply, turning to face her. "You read the trash. You know I don't want congratulations." The air left the room. He knew. Sylvia took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She gripped the handle of her cart, ready to run, ready to be fired. "Mr. Caldwell, I saw you," Bennett interrupted, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "3 weeks ago. I saw you take the letter from the bin. I saw you smooth it out. I saw you put it in your pocket." He stepped closer, closing the distance between the marble desk and the cleaning cart. The social chasm that separated them, the millions of dollars, the pedigree, the suit versus the uniform, seemed to evaporate, leaving only 2 terrified people in a high-rise tower. "Why did you keep it?" he asked. He didn't sound angry. He sounded desperate. "Why save the wreckage?" "Because it wasn't wreckage," Sylvia said, finding a sudden, defiant courage. She looked up into his dark, tormented eyes. It was the most beautiful thing in this entire building. Because it was the truth. Bennett stared at her. He looked at her gray eyes, seeing her for the first time not as a listener, but as a witness. He realized that this invisible woman knew him better than the fiancé he was supposed to propose to, better than the father who controlled his trust fund. She had read his soul in the garbage. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out another envelope. This one wasn't crumpled. It was sealed. Pristine. He held it out to her. "Then take this one," Bennett said, his voice trembling slightly. "Since you are the only archivist of my actual life." Sylvia looked at the envelope. She hesitated. Taking the first letter had been a secret, Taking this one was a contract. It was an acknowledgement that they were playing a dangerous game in the shadows of the glass tower. She reached out. Her fingers brushed his, a jolt of electricity that made both of them flinch. She took the letter. "Read it when you get home," Bennett commanded softly. "And tomorrow, tell me if the bridge is going to snap." He grabbed his coat and walked out, leaving Sylvia standing alone in the center of his office, holding his heart in her hands, knowing that the engagement he spoke of was the storm, but she was holding the lightning rod. Sylvia sat at her kitchen table, the peeling laminate surface cold under her elbows. The second letter lay open before her. She had read it 12 times since her shift ended at dawn. The handwriting was less jagged than the first note. It flowed with a desperate, lyrical honesty. "I used to think architecture was about creating shelter," Bennett had written. "But since I met you, I realize I've been building cages. You asked if the bridge would snap. The truth is, Sylvia, I am praying that it does. I am praying for the collapse because I don't know how to walk off the edge on my own." It wasn't a love letter in the traditional sense. It was something more dangerous. It was a surrender. He was placing the detonator of his life into the hands of the woman who polished his floors. For the first time in 3 years, since the day the music stopped in her life, Sylvia felt a melody rising in her chest. It was faint, trembling, but it was there. She folded the letter and placed it against her heart, beneath the gray fabric of her uniform. She went to work that night with her head high. She wasn't just the cleaner. She was the confidant. She was the architect's escape plan. But when the elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, the silence she expected was gone. The office was ablaze with light. It was 10 p.m., but the air was thick with the roar of conversation, the clinking of crystal, and the sickeningly sweet scent of lilies. A string quartet played in the corner. Mozart played with technical proficiency but zero soul. Sylvia froze, clutching the handle of her cart. She tried to hit the button to close the elevator doors, to retreat into the shadows, but a group of men in tuxedos stepped out, blocking the sensor. She was trapped. She pushed her cart to the side, trying to become invisible, trying to blend into the wall as she had done 1,000 times before. But tonight, the contrast was too sharp. The gray jumpsuit against the sea of black velvet and silk was a scream. And then she saw him. Bennett stood in the center of the room, near the model of the new city library. He looked devastatingly perfect. His tuxedo fit like a second skin, armor plating for the modern night. He held a champagne flute in one hand and the hand of a woman in the other. Elena Moore. She was beautiful in the way a statue is beautiful, cold, polished, and expensive. She laughed at something Bennett said, leaning into him, claiming him with a casual, terrifying ownership. Bennett wasn't looking at Elena. He was scanning the room, his eyes darting toward the exits, toward the shadows. He looked like a man drowning in plain sight. Then, his gaze landed on the elevator bank. He saw Sylvia. For a heartbeat, time suspended. The Mozart stopped. The laughter faded. It was just the two of them, connected by the invisible thread of the letters burning in her pocket. Sylvia waited for him to move. She waited for him to step away from Elena, to acknowledge the truth he had written about. Bennett's eyes widened. Panic, raw and unfiltered, flashed across his face. And then he looked away. He turned his back on her. He leaned down and whispered something to Elena, who smiled brighter. He took a sip of his champagne, sealing his mouth shut. We believe the words written in the dark, forgetting that ink fades the moment it is exposed to the harsh light of reality. Sylvia felt the blow as if it were physical. He hadn't just ignored her, he had erased her. He had chosen the cage. You must be the night staff. The voice was low, gravelly, and dripped with condescension. Sylvia turned. An older man stood beside her cart. He had Bennett's eyes, but without the warmth or the torture. They were hard, calculating eyes. This was Arthur Caldwell, the patriarch. "I'm sorry, sir," Sylvia whispered, gripping the card until her knuckles turned white. I didn't know there was an event. I'll leave. Wait, Arthur said. He didn't raise his voice, but the command was absolute. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of scotch and old money. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a background check. Sylvia saw her own photo, a mugshot from a traffic violation years ago, grainy and unflattering. My son has a habit of collecting broken things, Arthur said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. Stray dogs, flawed designs, and apparently tragic pianists who now scrub toilets. Sylvia flinched. He knew. He told me about your little conversations. Arthur lied smoothly. He gestured toward Bennett, who was now being toasted by a senator across the room. He feels sorry for you, my dear. Bennett has a savior complex. He writes letters to vent his stress. He finds a sympathetic ear in the help, and then he moves on. It's a mechanism, nothing more. The words were precise, surgical strikes designed to dismantle her dignity. He didn't mean them, Sylvia asked, her voice barely audible. Look at him, Arthur pointed. Sylvia looked. Bennett was raising his glass. He was smiling. It was a tight, pained smile, but to the world, it was a victory. He is marrying Elena Moore in the spring, Arthur said, turning back to Sylvia. That is his reality. You are just a draft he crumples up and throws away. The pain was blinding. It wasn't just rejection, it was humiliation. She had believed she was his equal in the dark, but in the light, she was just a charity case for a bored prince. Sylvia reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed the second letter. The paper felt hot, radioactive. She pulled it out. She didn't tear it. That would be too dramatic, too emotional. She simply placed it on the silver tray of a passing waiter, right next to the empty champagne flutes. Please give this to Mr. Caldwell, Sylvia said to the confused waiter. Tell him he dropped his trash. She didn't wait for a response. She turned her card around. Across the room, Bennett saw the movement. He saw the waiter approach. He saw the familiar cream-colored stationery on the tray. Sylvia! He shouted, his voice cracking, cutting through the murmur of the party. He dropped Elena's hand. He took a step toward the elevators, panic shattering his composure. But the doors were already closing. Sylvia stood in the metal box, tears finally spilling over her cheeks, washing away the hope she had foolishly allowed to take root. Through the narrowing gap of the doors, she saw Bennett running toward her, pushing guests aside, his face twisted in anguish. But it was too late. The steel doors slammed shut, severing the connection, leaving Bennett trapped in his glass tower and Sylvia descending rapidly into the darkness where she belonged. The elevator doors had sealed shut, but the silence they left behind was louder than the applause echoing through the 40th floor. Bennett stood frozen, staring at the brushed steel reflection of a man he no longer recognized. In his hand, he clenched the letter Sylvia had returned, the cream-colored paper now wrinkled, carrying the warmth of her pocket and the weight of her rejection. Let her go, Bennett. Arthur Caldwell's voice was calm, satisfied. He swirled his scotch, standing beside his son like a general surveying a battlefield he had just leveled with a single command. She was a variable we removed. Now go back to Elena. The senator is waiting for the toast. Bennett looked at his father. For 36 years, he had looked at Arthur and seen a blueprint for success. Tonight, he looked and saw only a demolition crew. What did you say to her? Bennett asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The ambient noise of the party, the string quartet, the laughter, seemed to fade into a dull buzz. I told her the truth, Arthur shrugged, adjusting his silk tie. That she is a temporary fascination, a coping mechanism. I saved her the embarrassment of thinking she belongs in this room. A coping mechanism. The words hit Bennett with the force of a wrecking ball. He realized then the cruelty of the architecture his father had built around him. It wasn't designed to keep him safe. It was designed to keep him numb. "She isn't the mechanism, Father," Bennett said, the realization crystallizing in his chest. "She is the only thing that makes the machine work." He didn't scream. He didn't make a scene. He simply turned and walked toward the emergency stairs. He didn't wait for the elevator. He needed the physical exertion. He needed the burn in his lungs to remind him he was still alive. He descended 40 flights of stairs, stripping off his tuxedo jacket as he ran, leaving the armor of the prince behind in the stairwell. He knew where she lived. He had seen the file Arthur had taunted her with. He had memorized the address in a single glance, filing it away not as data, but as a destination. An hour later, Bennett stood on a cracked sidewalk in a quiet, dimly lit neighborhood miles away from the glass tower. The wind was biting, rattling the bare branches of the street trees. He waited. He didn't have to wait long. Sylvia was walking down the block, still wearing her gray uniform, her coat pulled tight against the cold. She walked with the heaviness of someone carrying a broken melody. She stopped when she saw him standing on her stoop. She didn't look surprised. She looked exhausted. "You are a long way from the sky, Mr. Caldwell," Sylvia said, her voice hollow. She didn't look at his face. She looked at the unbuttoned collar of his shirt, the sweat on his neck. "Sylvia," Bennett breathed, stepping forward. "Please, go home," she interrupted, stepping around him to put her key in the lock. "Your father made it very clear. I am the draft you throw away. I am the listener you use to feel better about your golden cage. I won't be that for you, Bennett. I have enough tragic songs in my life. I don't need to be a footnote in yours. My father lied." Bennett's voice cracked, echoing in the empty street. Sylvia froze, the key half turned in the lock. "He told you I pitied you?" Bennett asked, moving closer, daring to enter her orbit. "He told you that I wrote those letters to vent." "He said I was a mechanism," Sylvia whispered, not turning around. "I didn't write them to vent," Bennett said, his voice dropping to a raw, desperate timbre. "I wrote them because I was suffocating. I wrote them because every time I looked at a blueprint, I felt nothing, but every time I looked at the back of your head while you cleaned my office, I felt possibility." Sylvia turned then. Her eyes were wet, swimming with the hurt he had caused. "Then why did you turn away?" she demanded, the anger finally breaking through the sadness. "In the office, when I was trapped, you saw me, and you turned your back. You drank your champagne and you let me drown." "I turned away," Bennett confessed, the shame coloring his tone. "Not because I was ashamed of you, Sylvia. I turned away because I was ashamed that you were seeing me in my cage. I couldn't bear for you to see me playing the role of the puppet. I wanted to protect the version of me that exists in the dark with you. We hide our faces not to conceal our lies, but because we are terrified that the people who love us will finally see the cowardice we have spent a lifetime dressing up as duty." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled letter, the one she had returned on the tray. He held it out to her. "You called this trash," Bennett said softly, "but it's the only contract I have ever wanted to sign." Sylvia looked at the paper. She looked at the man standing in the cold, shivering not from the wind, but from the terrifying act of being seen. He had descended from the tower. He had chased her into the shadows. "If I take that," Sylvia warned, her voice trembling, "it changes everything. There is no going back up the elevator, Bennett. If you stand here with me, you're standing in the ruins." "I'm done with skylines," Bennett replied, taking a step closer until he could smell the faint scent of lemon polish and rain that clung to her. "I want to build something on the ground." He didn't try to touch her. He respected the line she had drawn. He simply offered the letter, offered his truth, and waited to see if she would let him in or leave him out in the cold he had built for himself. Sylvia looked at his hand. She saw the ink stains on his fingers, stains from words meant only for her. Slowly, Tentatively, she reached out. She didn't take the letter. Instead, she placed her hand over his, covering the paper, pressing it against his palm. "It's a mess," she whispered, a small, fragile smile touching her lips. "I know," Bennett breathed, hope flaring in his chest like a match struck in the dark. "But I hear the best music comes from the mess." Sylvia turned the key. The lock clicked open, a sound that was louder than any symphony. She pushed the door open and stepped into the warmth of the hallway. She didn't close it. She left it open, a dark rectangle of invitation, waiting for the architect to finally step into a room he hadn't designed, but where he might finally live. The hallway of Sylvia's apartment was narrow, smelling of old timber and the faint, sweet scent of vanilla. It was a universe away from the antiseptic, climate-controlled perfection of the Caldwell and Moore offices. Here, the floorboards creaked. Here, the heat rattled in the pipes. Bennett stepped inside, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, sealing out the wind and the expectations of the world he had just fled. He stood in the center of her small living room, looking around with a reverence that felt out of place for a man accustomed to penthouses. He saw the stack of books on the radiator. He saw the single mug in the sink. And then he saw it. In the corner, covered by a heavy quilt, stood the silhouette of an upright piano. It was a ghost in the room, much like Sylvia had been a ghost in his office. "You haven't played," Bennett said softly, gesturing toward the instrument. It wasn't a question. The dust on the quilt spoke for itself. "Not for 3 years," Sylvia whispered, hanging her coat on a hook, her hands trembling slightly. "Since my father died, the music, it felt like speaking a language no one else understood anymore. So I stopped speaking." Bennett walked over to the piano. He didn't pull the cover off. He waited. He understood the sanctity of structures that were holding back a flood. "I spent my life drawing buildings I would never live in," Bennett said, his voice low and rough. "I wrote letters I never intended to send. We are both architects of our own silence, Sylvia. But tonight, I think the walls have finally come down." He turned to her. In the soft, yellow light of the apartment, stripped of his tuxedo jacket, his tie, and his arrogance, he looked human. He looked breakable. "Play for me," he asked. It was a plea more intimate than a touch. "You read my soul in the trash, Sylvia. Let me hear yours." Sylvia looked at him. She looked at the man who had run down 40 flights of stairs to find her. She realized that the tension she had spoken of, the tension that kept the bridge from snapping, wasn't about holding on. It was about letting go. She walked to the piano. Her hand gripped the quilt. With a sharp inhale, she pulled it back. The wood was scarred, the keys slightly yellowed, but it was beautiful. She sat on the bench. Bennett didn't hover. He sat on the floor, leaning his back against the wall, closing his eyes. He became the audience she had lost. Sylvia placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers, callous from scrubbing marble and wringing out cloths, remember the shape of the chords. She played. It wasn't a grand concerto. It was a nocturne, slow, melancholic, and aching with a beauty that filled the small room, pushing into the corners, chasing away the shadows. The music rose and fell, a conversation between her past and her present. As she played, Bennett felt the knot in his chest, the one that had been tightening for 36 years, begin to unravel. He realized that this was the design he had been searching for. Not steel, not glass, but resonance. We build glass walls to convince the world we are invincible, forgetting that glass doesn't just protect us, it puts our loneliness on display, and it is only when the glass shatters that we can finally touch the things we love. The last note faded into the air, hanging there like a suspended breath. Sylvia took her hands off the keys. She didn't turn around. Her shoulders were shaking. Bennett stood up. He walked to the bench and sat down beside her. He didn't say it was beautiful. He didn't offer a critique. He simply reached out and took her hand, the hand of the pianist, the hand of the cleaner, and pressed it to his chest, right over his heart. "I'm going to be sued," Bennett said softly, the reality of his defection settling in, but lacking its former terror. "My father will freeze the accounts. The merger will collapse. I will be the architect who burned down his own firm." "You're going to be ruined," Sylvia whispered, turning to look at him, her gray eyes clear and dry. "Yes," Bennett smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had ever seen on his face. "But look at the view from the ground floor, Sylvia. It's real." He leaned in. The space between them, once filled with social strata and unspoken rules, was now filled only with the echo of the music. When he kissed her, it tasted like the end of a long, cold winter. It wasn't a kiss of desperation. It was a seal on a new contract, one written not in ink, but in shared breath. Narrator. The sun rose late the next morning, struggling through the gray clouds of the city. But inside the apartment, the light was warm. Bennett Caldwell did not go into the office. The phone in his pocket buzzed incessantly. Lawyers, partners, his father, until the battery finally died, silencing the demands of the Meridian Tower forever. He sat at Sylvia's kitchen table, wearing yesterday's shirt, watching her pour coffee into two mismatched mugs. He watched the way the morning light caught the stray hairs escaping her messy bun. He watched her hands, no longer hidden in rubber gloves, but holding the ceramic with strength and grace. They had no money. They had no plan. The future was a blank sheet of paper, terrifying and white. But as Bennett looked at the woman who had dusted his life until she found the man underneath, he realized he didn't need a blueprint anymore. He reached across the table and took her hand. Sylvia squeezed back, a silent promise that they would build something new, brick by brick, without a single wall of glass between them. She had cleaned his office after hours, scrubbing away the footprints of his false life, only to find that the debris he left behind was the map to her own heart. And in the end, they learned that the most enduring structures aren't the ones that scrape the sky, but the ones that are strong enough to hold the weight of two people finally telling the truth. He spent a lifetime designing monuments for strangers, never realizing that his true legacy was found in the letters he was too afraid to send, and the woman brave enough to read them.